One thing I love is when I discover a word that sums up a pretty universal phenomenon. An experience that most people have had, that's common, or maybe culturally specific, that someone has studied enough to give it a specific name. And recently, I discovered one. You've probably had this experience. You're having a conversation, or reading an article, or listening to the news, and suddenly you think, I've heard that word so many times, I don't even know what it means anymore. Try saying the word pattern or chimney over and over again 20 times. You'll feel it. That phenomenon is called semantic satiation. It's a psychological phenomenon where the repetition of a word, whether spoken or read, causes it to temporarily lose meaning for the listener or the reader. And as I learned about it, I wondered if semantic satiation can happen over years. You hear a word enough times, in enough contexts, with enough assumptions about the fact that we're all on the same page about the meaning, and you eventually go, I'm not actually sure what I know, if I know what that actually means. Perhaps a dicey thing to admit as a pastor, but I sort of feel like I have semantic satiation with the word faith. I bring this up because this passage about Peter and Jesus is so often taken to be the classic passage on what it means to have faith. And the more I listen to the word faith, the more I realize that we, as folks of many different faiths and spiritualities, don't always mean the same thing when we talk about faith. And I think we have general cultural narratives, no matter the religion, about being a person who is full of faith or who lacks faith. And so in today's passage, when Jesus says to Peter, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" we usually can't help but read it as rebuke or chastisement. Jesus calling Peter to account for not having as much faith as he should. And in turn, I think it's common to hear this passage and ask ourselves the question, what are the ways I don't have enough faith? And under that question, I think can sometimes be the incorrect assumption that our faithlessness or faithfulness is a measure of our goodness or worthiness. I'll say plainly that this culturally baked in assumption that correlates faithfulness to goodness, I don't think it's correct. We are already inherently good and worthy of love. So this week, when I read this story of Jesus and Peter encountering each other on the stormy seas, I thought, a Jesus that only chastises me for being not good enough, not having enough faith, that doesn't really work for me. I don't change for the better when my interior monologue is self-denigrating. And I've come to know a God who doesn't ask me to be anything other than human. Accountable, kind, justice-minded, courageous, sure, but still just human. So what do we do with this story? We come to this story, as Alan said, after Jesus and the disciples have been together for months and months going about their ministry. Jesus has delivered the Sermon on the Mount, has healed the sick and calmed storms. He shared wisdom and prophecies about how to live in countercultural ways that move the world towards justice and love. He has taught and preached and told parables and was rejected at his hometown of Nazareth. And this story comes right after Jesus feeds the 5,000. Peter knows Jesus. He was one of the first disciples called, and Peter has seen the way that the spirit of love and truth moves in the world through Jesus. So after Jesus feeds 5,000, he tells the disciples to get into their boat and head to the other side of the lake as he goes up the mountain to pray. And as the evening comes, a windstorm whips up. And this isn't uncommon in Galilee. In fact, they were and still are common. One of the characteristic weather patterns of that region are sudden and frequent windstorms. And as fishermen, most of the disciples would have been used to this. And that's why if you pay attention, at this point in the night, the disciples are not afraid of the windstorm. They're afraid of what they think is a ghost approaching, walking on water. And so Jesus says to them, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come onto the water. And Jesus says, come. And so Peter steps out onto the water. As a child, my mother had this cute little box with these tiny little cards that had Bible verses printed on them. And I remember from the time I could almost read, my favorite verse in that little box was Hebrews 11:1. And she eventually gave that card to me. I still have it tucked away in my wallet. And it reads, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It defines faith for us. So while the meaning of faith has felt murkier for me these days, I've learned to lean more heavily on the interplay of hope and trust or conviction in its place. What can I hope towards? What do I hope is the movement and end goal of justice and love in the world? What do I hope the heart of God or the spirit of life and love is? What's a world worth hoping for? And what do I trust? What do I know deep in my bones and can trust is true? What do I trust is the movement of love in the world? And how can I trust the source of life and love to show up in the world? How does it manifest assuredly? Hope is a practice. Trust is a practice. And they require vulnerability. And the thing about this passage is that I see Peter showing up with hope and trust in spades. Peter hopes that this specter on the water is Jesus, because we see in the scriptures that Peter loves Jesus. He finds hope and solace and a new way to be in the world by watching Jesus live. And so in this storm, Peter hopes that the ghost indeed is his friend Jesus, and he trusts. Peter trusts when Jesus beckons. Jesus will make a way. And so he steps out on the water, trusting that if Jesus beckons him towards himself, he'll be able to walk on the water despite it being impossible. Hope and trust in spades. And then the part of the story where Peter becomes a warning for us all. He succumbs to fear, starts to sink, and then Jesus chastises him. But if this is all we see, I think we miss two important things. First, when Peter starts to sink, the scripture says Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and caught him. And then second, before they even get back in the boat, Jesus says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" What if? What if instead of disappointment in Jesus' voice, we saw a twinkle of pride and encouragement in Jesus' eyes? Imagine this, or maybe you don't have to imagine. Think back to a time when you taught a child to swim or ride a bike or something that took skill and practice and courage and maybe most important, trust. Trust in themselves, in their abilities, in their bodies and minds' capabilities, and equally important, trust that you would be there to pick them up if they fell down. And imagine this child, whom you love, starts pedaling towards you, and realizing how fast they're going, feeling the wind on their face, too forcefully maybe, suddenly they tip over. I can only imagine you all giving a response akin to, "Oh my goodness, look at that, you were doing it. Look how you rode that whole stretch, bucking up your courage. This next time, remember to trust yourself. You know how to do this. Even when it feels scary, trust that if you keep doing what we practice, you will stay upright. And if you don't, I will be there to pick you up." Or closer to the text, I imagine not shame or rebuke intoned in what Jesus was saying, but something closer to, "Oh, little one, still learning to have deep, expansive faith in the face of storms. Why did you doubt what your deepest self was telling you? That stepping out towards where I lead, while not always safe, is something worth hoping towards. And look at the way you trusted that I would catch you if you faltered. That trust is holy. I will always, immediately, reach my hand out if you call for me." It's not about walking on water. It's rarely about the miraculous. It's about seeing a specter of what might be fullness of life and love and saying, I want to be the way you are. I want to go wherever you're headed. Sometimes we get just a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven, just a specter. And I think what Jesus was saying was, beloved, you know in your gut, in the deepest parts of yourself, that this is the direction you want to head, how you want to be. Don't let the storms of this life, the fear of what may come if you step out in courage, make you second guess what you know is true. Take heart, take the deepest knowledge of your heart, and practice hope. And trust that if you falter, I'll be there to take your hand and invite you to keep at it. I believe that this is still the same thing the Spirit of life and truth says to us today. There is gentleness and truth to reframing this passage, from Jesus shaming Peter to Jesus lovingly inviting Peter. But the invitation of Jesus is always bigger than we can imagine, so the both and beckons. Hearing the voice of God as a gentle, reassuring invitation, like a loving adult to a child, allows us to avoid shame spirals and combat the lie that the times when we are human and falter make the full measure of who we are. But I also think we're called to mature faith. The gift of holding the both and, moving towards spiritual maturity, is the truth that when we can hold ourselves graciously, we can better, more fully hold ourselves to account. We can better, more fully look in the face the world's big problems and practice courage in a bolder, more faithful way. Theologian Warren Carter writes that the phrase, "you of little faith," is used a few times in Matthew and indicates not an absence of faith, but a little faith that must grow stronger and not be swamped or paralyzed by apparently overwhelming circumstances. And as Alan cued you in, the circumstances of the time were overwhelming. There are moments for graciousness and there are moments for calling ourselves boldly into growth, the pastoral and the prophetic, and they have to live together. The world is full of suffering. It was then, and it is now. There is a physical and spiritual hunger. You saw it in last week's sermon as Jesus fed the 5,000. Material, physical hunger still plagues the most vulnerable. And a spiritual hunger, as we have what the Surgeon General calls an epidemic of loneliness. There's disconnection and strife in relationships and in families, and there is real and vast oppression, and the powers that be try to squash attempts at those who work towards liberation. The reality is, for the most marginalized, the stakes are life and death, flourishing or suffering. Jesus calls us to practice again and again, growing into a faith that falls in step with what the activist Angela Davis says. We have to act like it's possible to radically transform the world, and we have to do it all the time because the stakes are high. But if we only chastise ourselves, if we only view ourselves as failures, as those with too small a faith, it's easy to lose hope, and it's easy to lose trust in the Spirit's ability to move us towards a more whole world. We need that gracious voice that speaks to the hope and trust and courage we are already living into. Can we be gracious with ourselves as well as honest with ourselves? Can we see hope and trust and courage as practices rather than static characteristics? And can we practice keeping our eyes peeled for a vision of the world that's so breathtakingly whole that we will hope against hope and be willing to live courageously for it? Peter fails many more times in the gospel stories, but he grows in hope and trust in God's vision for the world such that he's eventually crucified for it. The love and grace of God, the friendship, gentleness, and prophetic call of Jesus buoy him such that he's willing to live with great courage, and that courage led him down paths that were dangerous. And I can only imagine that his courage was not kept afloat by shame, but by his loving memory of Jesus, saying, "Dear one, still learning to have deep expansive faith in the face of storms. Take heart. Listen to the deepest parts of yourself, the deepest part of your heart where the divine beckons, calling you into bigger visions for the world, stepping out towards where I lead. It's not always safe, but it is something worth hoping towards. Know that I will always, immediately, reach my hand out if you call for me. May we have faith that the Spirit says the same thing to us. Amen.